Welcome to PodcastRx, a production of Diamond Pharmacy Services. This is a show about pharmacy, but don't let the title fool you. While we definitely talk with pharmacists about medication topics, we also sit down with nurses, technicians, and other pros to discuss relevant issues in corrections health, long-term care, and so much more. Whether you're a pharmacist, a practitioner, or just find these things fascinating, this is a show for you. On this episode,
I think it's going to take a little bit of time, probably 5 to 10 more years of education and utilization within the U.S. for confidence to be put in biosimilars.
Biologic medications are some of the most innovative drugs on the market and some of the most expensive. In their place, biosimilar medications promise to make the treatment benefits of biologics more accessible. While biosimilars bear no significant clinical difference to their biologic counterparts and face rigorous FDA approval pathways, biosimilars lack utilization, lack confidence from healthcare providers and patients, and struggle to come to market due to innovator biologic patents.
We really have to remember that biosimilars are here to help bring down costs and improve access for patients.
Erica Gray of the Diamond Drug Information Center joins us to break down these factors and to give us a better understanding of just what is holding back biosimilars. I'm Adam Campbell, and this is PodcastRx.
All right, well, I want to welcome back Erica Gray to the podcast. We've only had, this will be our 12th episode, and you've been on 3 of them so far, including this one. So welcome back again.
Thanks for having me. I'm always happy to help.
Absolutely. And thank you for being a constant contributor that way. So we were talking about new episode ideas, and we reached out to you and your colleagues in the Drug Information Center. And you bounced back with some really great topics, one of which we just recorded an episode for, drug diversion, and now the listeners would have heard that one. And another one that you brought up was biosimilars. And I'm just going to read the exact notes you gave me because I think this really guides the episode well. And you said biosimilars are a bit controversial right now. In a nutshell, these products are highly similar to their innovator biologic counterparts, and despite having a rigorous FDA approval pathway, biosimilars lack utilization, lack confidence from healthcare providers and patients, and struggle to come to market due to innovator biologic patents. Overall, a lot has really held biosimilars back from helping to drive medication costs down. So I wanted to know more about this in detail. And I guess before we even get into talking about biosimilars, we have to understand biologics. So Erica, can you explain what a biologic medication is? What are some of the things they're typically used to treat? And what are some of the more recognizable biologics on the market?
Yeah, starting off, I want to just go over what a biologic medication is in comparison to our small molecules, like the difference between these two products. So the FDA specifically describes biologics as products that can be composed of sugars, proteins, nucleic acids, or complex combinations of these substances. Or they may be living entities such as cells or tissues. So what you need to take away from this is that biologics are these agents that are really complex molecules. I think biologics are really interesting because they may be produced in living systems, which is really unique and different from small molecules. So they could be produced in living systems like animal cells, plant cells, or microorganisms. And then they're also produced through biotechnology methods and other technologies. So this is very different from our small molecules, which go through chemical synthesis, which is generally more predictable and easier to do. So that's one really big thing that I want to explain about biosimilars. And I really want to reassure everyone that while they are complex molecules, they are carefully monitored throughout the production process to ensure they have consistency from batch to batch for a particular biologic.
So Erica, what are typical biologics out there? What are they often used to treat? What are some of the more recognizable biologics?
Yeah. So let me take you through some examples. You might say, oh, wow, I didn't realize that was a biologic whenever I start to go through some of these. So some examples that you might hear on a day-to-day basis and not think about are vaccines. So our influenza vaccine is a biologic. Proteins such as hormones are another biologic. And whenever I say hormones, the example I'm going to give here is insulin. It's more of a complex protein. So the examples are like insulin glargine. So we have Lantus or Basaglar, insulin Lispro, which is Humalog, or insulin Aspart, which is Novolog. Remember I talked about how these are made in living living systems. Actually, insulins that I just mentioned are produced utilizing non-pathogenic laboratory strains of bacteria, which is really cool. This is an example of a living system. And then proteins such as growth factors, such as filgrastim and pegfilgrastim, which are commonly used for patients who receive chemotherapy. And chemotherapy can decrease your white blood cell count and specifically your neutrophil count. So they work to help the body stimulate the production and maturation and activation of those neutrophils, which is a type of white blood cell, as I said, and is involved in the immune system. And the use of these agents can help to reduce time to neutrophil recovery and duration of fever. So it's really good for those patients receiving chemotherapy. And then another example that I want to include are monoclonal antibodies. These are probably what most people are on when we talk about biologics. Monoclonal antibodies are becoming more and more popular to use. Common disease states that use this type of medication are rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, plaque psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis. As you can see, a lot of inflammatory disease states. They're also used in cancer indications. And the reason being because they can specifically target things within the body. An example that I'll give you is a product on the market called adalimumab or Humira. That's probably one of the most common ones that we see. Infliximab or Remicade is another one that's commonly seen. And those treat those inflammatory disease states that I talked about, some of them. So notice how adalimumab ends in MAB, MAB. That tells you right there that it's a monoclonal antibody. For the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, these medications bind to something in the body that is involved in inflammation. Therefore, by binding to this, it prevents further cascade of inflammation downstream. So that's how it's like helping. It's stopping inflammation in the body due to that particular disease state. So yeah, those are just some common ones. Did you notice anyone? Have you heard of any of those?
Oh, definitely Humira for sure. And just to clarify, especially what we're talking about in this podcast, and I think you touched on it, was that we're really talking about the monoclonal antibodies. We're not talking about vaccines as being controversial. That's a whole other topic that, yes, you could do several podcasts on that. I'm sure you have a lot of strong feelings. I know I do, but we'll stay away from that.
Yeah.
But it's these type of drugs that are the subject of the controversies.
Yeah. It's going to be like your insulin products and your monoclonal antibodies primarily are the biosimilars that we talk about and that are going to come onto the market.
You brought up the small molecule versus the large molecules that you see in the biologic drugs. It's been a while since I've had chemistry. It's since high school, actually. So the long chemical name, the molecule name, CH whatever, and you have like way more letters and numbers than you do in your standard small molecule drug for sure. Yeah.
I gave an example during one of my presentations at NCCHC, and I talk about the drug olanzapine or Zyprexa and how its molecular weight is like 312 Daltons. And all I want you to take from this is now I'm going to say there's a drug called adalimumab, which is made up of 1,330 amino acids. So it's so much bigger, and its molecular weight is 149,000 Daltons. So you can think these molecules are so much bigger than our small molecules. So small really does mean small, and large really does mean large.
That's a great transition point to my next question. When you talk large molecules, also biologic drugs mean a large cost. They're expensive. Looking at some info from the Congressional Research Service, according to the Congressional Research Service, the annual cost of some biologic medications in the United States, such as Soliris, if I'm getting that right.
Yeah, Soliris.
And Vimizim, exceeds $250,000 per patient. And according to a 2019 white paper from the Biosimilars Council, brand name biologics are the, quote, most significant driver of prescription drug spending in the U.S. Since 2014, brand name biologic drugs have accounted for more than 90% of prescription drug spending growth. So naturally, with an expensive biologic comes the desire for a lower cost alternative. Enter the biosimilar. So, Erica, what exactly is a biosimilar and what makes a biosimilar an attractive medication option?
So biosimilars, whenever we think about the relationship between these and biologics, as you said, it's not similar to the conventional brand versus generic drug. To put it simply, biosimilars are more complex than our generic small molecule drugs, as I said before. And as I talked about before with biologics, these are pretty large molecules and require more complex production than what is typically required of the small molecules. So as an example, small molecules are produced as chemical synthesis, as I said before, which can be relatively predictable in that chemical process. Since this process is relatively predictable, generics are made and they're required to be bioequivalent. And what that means is that they're chemically identical. So remember the word identical here to their brand name drugs and their brand name counterparts. And whenever they're required to be bioequivalent, that means that they have to be identical based on safety, strength, route of administration, quality, performance characteristics, and intended use. So the big thing here is that small molecule drugs, the generics, are considered identical to the brand name drugs. Now, on the other hand, whenever we talk about our large molecule drugs or biologics, since they're produced in living systems, this process is definitely more complex. The biosimilars are required to be, on the other hand, highly similar. So we don't have that identical process that we would expect from a small molecule. So they're required to be highly similar to the reference biologic product, which is also called a biooriginator. And they're allowed to have minor differences in clinically inactive components, but no clinically meaningful difference in terms of safety, purity, and potency. So you can see here that there isn't an identical requirement for biosimilars, and it's because these molecules have such a different and more complex production method. For example, even from batch to batch between the same biologic, you'll probably see some differences in these and clinically inactive components. Another thing that I want to add about biosimilars is that they go through a rigorous FDA process, as you quoted me at the beginning of the episode. And they have to prove that they have highly similar pharmacokinetic properties and, if needed, pharmacodynamic properties. And these are just fancy words to say that they reach highly similar levels in the body that you would expect to their biooriginators. They're also metabolized and behaving similarly in the body compared to their biooriginator counterparts. And also, they'll have like immunogenicity testing. And this is another fancy word. I know I keep using these big words, but it involves making sure that the immune response is evaluated and compared between the biosimilar and the biooriginator so that your body's not going to behave differently than you would expect. And then lastly, biosimilars do go through some clinical studies to evaluate how well they work for a particular disease state compared to the biooriginator product. So biosimilars may not be studied in all of the indications that they seek approval for, but indications can be extrapolated. And I know this kind of worries a lot of people because, people will say, well, it wasn't evaluated in this particular disease state. But extrapolation can be done if the product has shown to be highly similar, as I talked about before, with regards to safety, efficacy, immunogenicity, and such. And you can confidently presume, based on sound scientific justification, that the mechanism for extrapolation indications to be similar to the other indications that they're studying or that they're seeking approval for. So the FDA is the counterpart that's going to look at the scientific justification for the data extrapolation. So in summary, these biosimilars are highly similar to the biooriginator with no clinically meaningful difference in terms of the safety, purity, and potency, and the indication extrapolation can occur in our biosimilars. So it is a bit different than what we typically see for our small molecule drugs, which are identical to their brand name drugs.
Sure. And all those things that you just pointed out, and especially the no clinically meaningful difference, and that you can extrapolate the indications. So with all that in mind, and the rigorous processes that are followed in the regulatory pipeline, where does the controversy start with biosimilars? Why are these not catching on the way that generics have in the small molecule drug world?
I definitely think, when generics came onto the market, there was some lack of uptake. Mm-hmm. So these are kind of like, our biosimilars are kind of like generics in the sense that they're, biosimilars to the biooriginator products, and they're relatively new. So the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act of 2009 was signed into law by President Obama in March 2010. So this created the 351K pathway. And all you really need to take away from that is that this 351K pathway was created, but the FDA is really responsible for reviewing how biosimilar applications and the appropriate regulatory pathways are created so that we can have biosimilars. So the FDA, the Biologic Price Competition Innovation Act of 2009 was enacted but we didn't really have the framework set up to get these things, approved and on the market. So I think that because we didn't have that pathway set up, there's a lot of distrust, in the system. You really have to trust the FDA to be approving medications appropriately to make sure that they're safe and effective for these patients. And I think patients are skeptical just based on the fact, like we talked about before, not all of the indications are going to be evaluated for these medications. It is a complex pathway. I did talk about that before. So providers might be concerned that, it's not the same as the biooriginator product, and basically looking at, the production pathway does have to be a little bit different for these biosimilar products. So I think we're still kind of grappling it in the United States, and we're still trying to get confident in these things. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time, probably 5 to 10 more years of education and utilization within the U.S. for confidence to be put in biosimilars. Because I think whenever we look at our European counterparts, they had their first biosimilar approved in 2006. So you can imagine there's a lot more biosimilars over in Europe. They have over a decade of utilization. Based on their experiences, the EU has a monitoring system for safety concerns, and it hasn't identified any relevant differences in the nature, severity, or frequency of adverse effects between biosimilars and their reference medicines. So I think that should give us a little bit more reassurance. Typically, you have a pharmaceutical company, it might be a global pharmaceutical company, so we might be getting the same product that Europe's getting whenever it comes to a biosimilar product. So I think based on European experience, we should have a little bit more confidence. But right now, we're just in the beginning phases of getting biosimilars on the market. So I understand that people are a little bit more apprehensive of utilization.
Another thing that I saw in looking into this topic before we got together today, there's some market forces at play and aside from just the regulatory factors. So things that I saw come up, patent thickets, rebate traps. Can you take us through that and how that affects the adoption of biosimilars?
Yeah. So to talk about patents, and I think there's two really big things that are kind of holding, aside from patients and providers being apprehensive about using these medications, patent thickets or, patent litigation and rebates are also big parts of the lack of uptake. So when biosimilars get approved, there are a few more hurdles. Exclusivity and patent litigation is definitely one of them. So the biooriginator may have patents and exclusivity that prevent a biosimilar from coming to market. There is a patent process under the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act of 2009 that involves interactions between the biooriginator and the biosimilar companies regarding patent infringement and validity. It is often called like a patent dance, but this process is not mandatory. And also there's other patent litigation that can occur even between the biosimilars and other biosimilars. And I don't want to go into the weeds on the whole litigation process because I'm not a lawyer. I'm a pharmacist and I'm not a patent expert. But what you need to know is that patent litigation essentially can hold up a biosimilar from entering the market until the litigation is finished. And this can often take a lot of time. If listeners are interested, there is a nice article called How Logically Impossible Patents Block Biosimilars. It was published in August of 2019 by two law professors, W. Nicholson Price and R.D. Ray. It was published in the Nature Biotechnology Journal, and I encourage anyone who really wants to get in the weeds on patents and patent litigation with regards to biosimilars to look up this article and go into it a little bit more in depth. So on one hand, we have innovation. So patents are great because they protect and help us be innovative and promote innovation. However, on the other hand, utilization of patents excessively and patent litigation can really cause quite a difficult entry for the biosimilars to come to market. And we really have to remember that biosimilars are here to help bring down costs and improve access for patients. Then the other thing that I want to mention that's another big hurdle are rebates and discounts. Drug manufacturers can work with prescription benefit managers to offer rebates or discount prices on medications. So as an example, a drug could be bought for X amount of dollars from a pharmaceutical company, but then the drug company has negotiated with the prescription benefit manager to offer a rebate, which can be a certain amount of money that is paid back to the prescription benefit manager when a particular drug is bought. So overall, the medication may end up costing less for the prescription benefit manager. And not often is that list price less for the patient. So you have to remember, like, rebates can, because there's this price incentive, could prevent, these biosimilars from being preferred on a formulary list. So that could, prevent them from being on formulary and prevent utilization. It really does come down to, patent litigations and then also preference on that formulary list to influence utilization.
It's a pretty small number of biosimilars that are currently licensed, and that's not to say that are marketed. That's an even smaller. Is it 26? Is that the number I'm getting right?
Yeah, I think it's around 26.
Yeah, we can fact check that for sure and have that in the show notes, along with the resource you just provided there. So you mentioned all those different hurdles to bringing them to market, for improving access. So that the Biosimilar Council white paper I mentioned earlier, it said that brand name biologic company, anti-competitive tactics, and perverse market access barriers have cost America's patients nearly $10 billion since 2015. Patients, taxpayers, and the overall healthcare system are bearing the costs. So that's a pretty staggering figure. So is it fair to say, Erica, that the deck is generally stacked against providers utilizing these things, even if they really wanted to? I mean, we haven't gotten into the skepticism that they feel and patients feel, and we'll get into that here in just a bit. But is that fair to say it's just generally tough if you're a provider to use biosimilars? Yeah,
it's all going to come down to the payer. Whatever's on formulary is kind of going to push the hand of the provider. So they could want to use the biosimilar because they're comfortable using it. They understand that the price is less, that efficacy is similar between the biooriginator and the biosimilar. But really, based on what the patient's insurance will cover is what they're going to have to write for it at the end of the day. And that can be different from plan to plan. So yeah, I mean, providers can want to use them and be, supportive of them. But really at the end of the day, you just have to look at who's paying for the drug. And typically that's like the patient and the insurance company.
We're going to take a little break now to tell you a little more about the Diamond Drug Information Center. On a personal level, we all appreciate when our pharmacist gives us a thorough consultation for a new or complex medication. They dispense not only the drug, but important information about dosing and possible interactions. This kind of medication counseling is easy to understand on a personal level, but what about on an institutional level? Where do healthcare providers, especially those delivering care to large populations with diverse needs, go when they need medication counseling? Enter the Diamond Drug Information Center. The pharmacists of the Drug Info Center dispense in-depth clinical consultation for all of Diamond's customers, from correctional facilities to nursing homes. This team of PharmDs specializes in pharmacotherapy and disease state management. And if you have questions about dosing, drug-drug interactions, non-formulary medication requests, therapeutic alternatives, or you just need general clinical advice, they're a call away. They also take proactive steps to educate healthcare professionals. They issue regular clinical updates, and they develop webinars and presentations about specific drug topics. You can reach the Diamond Drug Information Center at 800-882-6337, extension 1834, or email them druginfo@diamondpharmacy.com. And now back to PodcastRx. Welcome back to PodcastRx. Our guest is Erica Gray, and we're talking about biosimilars. Erica, on the level of patients, so when we're talking about patient utilization of biosimilars, are you seeing any kind of resistance there? I mean, we talked regulatory, we talked about payers, market forces, but what about right when you go down to the patients? Even though there's no clinically meaningful difference between them, does that give anyone pause as far as taking them? What do you see there?
Yeah, I definitely think that patients are apprehensive, and rightfully so, especially these patients that are on medications for like the inflammatory disease state reasons. A lot of questions probably come up with their providers. Why do I have to switch if I'm stable on this medication with my particular disease state? I would understand if they wouldn't want to change, medications, even if it is a biosimilar, because those disease states, you definitely have to be empathetic that they are difficult to control patients at times. And there have been studies that have reported patients' lack of confidence in biosimilars. One study that I went to that really gave me some shocking results was by Teeple and colleagues. It was called Patients' Attitudes on Non-Medical Switching to a Biosimilar, results from an online patient survey in the United States. It was published in 2019 in the Journal of Current Medical Research and Opinion, and it surveyed over 1,700 patients, 18 years of age and older, with inflammatory diseases that I talked about before, like rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's, psoriatic arthritis, and psoriasis. And it surveyed them regarding these non-medical switches to a biosimilar. And non-medical switching is basically an insurance company will no longer cover or prefer the biooriginator. So then they prefer a biosimilar. And this kind of forces the hand of the physician that I talked about before to write for the biosimilar. Overall, in the study, they observed that 85% were concerned that biosimilars would not treat their disease state as well. 85% did not want to switch to a biosimilar if their current biologic was helping the disease. And 83% were concerned that switching could cause more side effects. So that's really concerning for me as a pharmacist because they're very concerned that the new biosimilar medication isn't going to help them. And not only that it might harm them with side effects. So you can see it's a pretty significant concern for these patients with the inflammatory diseases regarding the biosimilar switch. The biggest thing to think about is that sometimes these patients, as I said before, with the inflammatory disease states can be hard to manage. So, definitely being empathetic and making sure that you educate them is the best method for these patients.
With those patient concerns in mind, you see advertisements for these drugs all the time. The brand names get very, ingrained in the consciousness. And I'm assuming that's going to have an effect where people think that's the one I see, the suggestibility there, that's the one that I know of. So I want to stay on that particular biologic, and the biosimilar is not going to cut it for me. Mm-hmm. But also going back to generics versus brands, you mentioned that, generics didn't take off right away, that people mm-hmm. were initially resistant to that. Is just a repeat of that 20, 30 years later, do you think?
Yeah, I think, with, like you said, with the small molecule generics, there were issues. I mean, I still see it today as a pharmacist that people prefer brand, for a particular reason over the generic medication, or, patients will say the brand works better than the generic. But knowing and trusting in the FDA's process and, how they vet these out, the generics are expected to be bioequivalent or identical to the brand name medications. And you really have to trust that. I think biosimilars, it's a lot more is going on with it too, because they are more complex. Creation of them is, possibly in a living system, and they're much larger molecules. So I think that it's hard to wrap your head around that, especially from a consumer standpoint. If you're not a pharmacist, it could be, a little bit scary or hard to really understand. So I think being, understanding where the patients are coming from that sense. And maybe like you said, I mean, I haven't, heard the theory that maybe it is commercial influence, but that's definitely something that we have that's unique in the United States mm-hmm. compared to Europe, direct to consumer marketing. So maybe it is marketing that's affecting, these patients from wanting to use the medications, or from, providers wanting to use the medications.
Either way, it just underscores how important a pharmacist is to educating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you gave a presentation on this subject, biosimilars, that I had looked at before recording, and you brought up something called the Nocebo effect, which is my first time hearing of it. So I wanted to know, what is the Nocebo effect and why is it prevalent with biosimilars?
Yeah, there was actually, I hadn't heard, we've all heard placebo before, but Nocebo was not really something that I commonly had heard before. But there was a really nice publication from 2018 in Biodrugs, which is a journal, and the authors are Christensen and colleagues. It was titled Non-Pharmacologic Effects in Switching Medications, the Nocebo Effect in Switching from an Originator to Biosimilar Agent. I mean, this is perfect for this subject. The article does a nice job talking about the nocebo effect, and it defines nocebo as the incitement or worsening of symptoms induced by a negative attitude from non-pharmacologic therapeutic interventions, sham, or active therapies. Now, most of us, as I said before, probably heard the term placebo effect, which is when positive beliefs or beneficial outcomes occur from a positive communication about a sham treatment or a medication that the patient is willing or receiving. Sham just meaning placebo. So they're not really actually receiving active drug. So you can see here that placebo effect is linked to positive beliefs and nocebo effect is linked to negative beliefs. So biosimilars are relatively new in the US, so anything that is new is concerning to a patient and provider, and it's good to be skeptical at times. However, the authors in the article that I mentioned talk about 3 particular aspects that trigger the nocebo effect. They first talk about negative information, and they state that if a patient hears negative information about biosimilars, for example, that the biosimilars are worse or cause more side effects, it could promote the nocebo effect. So, if somebody tells a patient, well, I heard that the biosimilars don't work as well, then they go into treatment with that belief. So it's really important that patients are educated and informed. Consent is obtained when switching medications such as from a biooriginator to a biosimilar. And I really emphasize that, making sure that the patient is okay with switching, that they give their informed consent and know that they're switching to the biosimilar agent. The other big thing is lack of knowledge of biosimilar therapies is also another big concern. So it's really important that patients and providers are educated. As you talked about before, me as a pharmacist educating my patients and providers on what a biosimilar is and how they are vetted by the FDA. And then also current data so that our patients and providers can gain confidence in these products. And then lastly, the authors talk about lack of coherence with what is being discussed with patients and providers about biosimilars across the healthcare system. So thinking about, what physicians, nurses, pharmacists, and other healthcare professionals are actually communicating to our patients and making sure that we are all consistent and coherent on what we, talk to patients about with regards to biosimilars. So as you can see, these 3 points that they make with nocebo effect is basically just that we really need to make sure that we educate patients and that we educate them all equally and we're all coherent with what we're educating patients on.
We're certainly trying our best with this podcast.
Yep.
Want to move it closer to home, what you do every day here at Diamond and then the Drug Information Center. As, of course, a Drug Info Center pharmacist, you focus a lot on correctional facilities. So are biosimilars being utilized in that care environment?
Yeah. So I think, as you talked about before, how expensive these biologic products are, they are very expensive. So within the correctional facilities, that's definitely one thing as, a potential cost savings for our providers. I feel that some of our facilities are more cognizant that there are cost saving alternatives for patients within biosimilars. So they are and should be addressed whenever you talk about formulary management. Biologics typically aren't on formulary because they are so expensive and they're not really used in very common disease states like, a lot of people have acid reflux. That's probably a more common thing that we would see. But whenever it comes to biologics, they're more complex disease states. So non-formulary medications are typically reviewed by healthcare professionals to ensure that the patient has tried standard of care medications prior to moving on to more complex medications like biologics. So if a biooriginator is prescribed and standard of care options have been vetted and there is a biosimilar available for the biooriginator product, then I think that it would probably be wise to consider, having maybe a preferred biosimilar on formulary that's most cost effective for your patients. So I definitely think it's becoming more looked at as a potential cost saving place for our facilities. But, I can't really say that they're definitely not on formulary, but they may be preferred options.
Okay. And of course, a correctional facility is a very budget conscious place. So I would imagine that they'd be open to using them in theory. Yeah. And what kind of savings could you expect from if biosimilars become more mainstream and formulary someday? As they work toward that, what kind of savings do you think you could see for a correctional facility? Yeah,
I know there have been some publications that talk about we could save like hundreds of millions or billions of dollars if we use biosimilars. But I really want to bring it down to the patient level because I think that's easier to understand than big numbers. So biosimilars typically are priced about 15% to 30% less than the biooriginator product. So if you think about a treatment that costs $5,000 per month, you could be saving anywhere from $750 to $1,500 per month on just one patient, as long as that patient and provider are willing to use the biosimilar. Again, informed consent is a really important thing if you want to switch from a biooriginator to a biosimilar. And also, this isn't considering rebates or discounts. So just thinking about that from a price perspective, a 15 to 30% less, you could save a lot over a year for one patient. And I think that probably is the best way to explain it.
That's significant for sure. Mm-hmm. So, Erica, one last thing I do want to ask. So with being in the Drug Info Center every day, fielding a lot of questions, you mentioned the misconceptions between providers and patients, but with obviously you're working with providers. So how are you working with the providers each day to address any misconceptions? What kind of questions are you answering?
Yeah.
And moving the ball forward with biosimilars.
Yeah. So in the Drug Information Center, we do some non-formulary review for some of our sites. So sometimes we'll see a originator product come across. And I think the biggest thing that we can do is basically explain to them there are biosimilars available. One of the big things is that we can't therapeutically interchange anything whenever it comes to biosimilars. There's no product that's interchangeable as of now. And that's a whole different topic for another podcast. But interchangeability, no product is interchangeable at this point. So as a pharmacist, I can't switch things. So I have to definitely explain to the providers what our biosimilar options are, explaining costs to them, and then explaining like a switching process. So if it's a new script, it's pretty easy to explain the cost. If it's a patient that's been on a particular biooriginator and maybe the biosimilar is more cost effective for this patient, explaining that there is a biosimilar available, but they probably want to explain this to the patient. And then sometimes, getting on the phone with the provider and explaining it. A lot of the manufacturer websites are really good, and they go through all of the data that's been generated whenever it comes to switching from the biooriginator to the biosimilar. So that's a great place to go. I will say the package inserts of our biosimilar products have information from the biooriginator. So you're not going to get the data that you're kind of looking for, which is that switching data, switching from the biooriginator to the biosimilar. So you really have to, talk with the provider, make sure they're educated on what a biosimilar is, what the data looks like. A lot of our providers want to know what the data is and how it compared to the biooriginator. So I think that that's a good place as a pharmacist, somebody who, I definitely love data and I love explaining data. Being able to explain that to the providers is really beneficial for me and beneficial for them. And then if they're confident in the transition from the biooriginator to the biosimilar, making sure that they're comfortable talking to the patient about the switch and that the patient's okay with it.
Erica, thank you for taking a very complex topic and distilling it down to very easily digestible points.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I hope this was helpful for everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you. Wanted to add in a quick editor's note here. Shortly after we recorded this podcast, Erica Gray decided to move on from Diamond for another professional opportunity. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, Erica was a regular contributor to our young show. We at PodcastRx can't thank Erica enough for her contributions and expertise, and we wish her the very best as she moves forward with her career. Thanks for listening. This podcast features conversations with healthcare professionals. Their statements and opinions discussed herein are for informational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered professional medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for the advice of an appropriately qualified and licensed healthcare professional. Therefore, listeners must not rely on the statements made herein.
PodcastRx is a production of Diamond Pharmacy Services, the nation's largest correctional pharmacy provider. Catch our new episodes on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please rate the show and leave us a review. And if you have a topic you'd like to hear about on the show, or you'd like to share your thoughts on an episode, you can email us at podcastrx@diamondpharmacy.com. Music in this episode by Wolfgang Worley, sound expressed by Getty Images and the 126ers.